Okay, well, I guess why don't we get started, and some of the people coming on board will get some of the later information. But thank you for coming to our first presentation of collective trauma. And this is the first of four. And we have our guest Gilad Herschberger, who will actually define collective trauma and give us an overview. But before that, I just want to do a couple housekeeping issues. You notice that you are muted except for a couple people, so we'd like you to remain muted so there's no background noise. And if and when we get, Gilad's going to do about a 30-minute presentation to 40-minute. And if you have a question, you'll notice on the bottom of your screen is a chat, and you can ask your question in there. If you do not know how to use chat, most of you have my phone number. You can text me and I'll try to work the phone and this the Zoom meeting. If you really need something, wave and we'll try to get you there. And then I just want to make sure everyone is connected. So I think there's a couple of people still trying to get on that are texting me, so we'll wait a minute more. Okay, I think we're good. Let me introduce Gilad. Gilad is an associate professor of social and political psychology at the Interdisciplinary Center at Herzliya, Israel. His work focuses on collective existential threats and how threat perceptions influence and shape political cognitions. In his research, he focuses on threats located in the past that cast a long shadow on the present, such as the memory of collective trauma, as well as the perception of threats looming in the future, such as the Iranian nuclear threat. This research also distinguishes between threats of commission that are immediate and local, like terrorism, and threats of omission that are universal and slow to develop, like climate change and the viral pandemic. Studying populations worldwide, he shows that the perception of these threats is contingent on political ideologies, such as liberals and conservatives perceive certain threats while ignoring others. Professor Hirschberger also conducts applied research for various non-government organizations. This research, aiming to define the parameters of sustainable agreement between Israel and Palestinians, includes opinion polls and experimental surveys conducted on the general Israel population and on specific West Bank settler populations. Aside from his academic publishing, he also occasionally writes for magazines and newspapers in Israel and the US, such as the Washington Post. His book, Group Survival, The Psychology of Collective Threat, is forthcoming in Cambridge University Press. So we want to welcome you, Gilad, and waking up at 5 in the morning to be with us from Israel.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Sidney, and thank you to all of you for attending this talk in the series of lectures. I'm very excited to be here and excited about the opportunity to talk about something that interests me very much and I care about very much. And I think that isn't just interesting at the academic level. I think that perhaps, I hope, also has some useful practical implications that we can talk about today. So I will begin by uploading my presentation, my PowerPoint presentation. I'll try to keep it short to about 40 minutes. I have a lot to say. And I, of course, welcome your comments and questions. When talking about collective trauma in the context of everything that's going on in the world today, it's impossible to completely avoid all of the minefields of political sensitivities. So I will be talking a little bit about the political implications, and it's absolutely fine if you don't agree with me or have another opinion, and we can discuss that later. All right, so I will upload the PowerPoint.
Gilad, can I tell, while you're doing that, briefly how I met you?
Ah, okay.
So I was doing a lot of research on this and found a paper that you had written in the US government files somehow. And then on a whim contacted you back in August, I think, maybe And you answered my email right away, and I was thrilled. And then one thing left to another, you have helped me find all these professors all over the world. And one happened to be 10 minutes away from me. And very funny that our third speaker is at UC Irvine, and she just couldn't believe that you had to reach all the way around the world to find each other. So pretty fun.
Yeah, that is ironic, and I'm glad that we got her on board because she does fantastic work. I'll mention some of her work briefly today. Okay, so I'll be talking about collective trauma, and first we'll begin by defining what exactly it is, what are the long-term effects, the implications, etc., and then I will focus specifically on COVID-19 and ask whether COVID-19 constitutes a collective trauma, in what way, and what does that exactly mean for all of us. Okay, so first of all, in terms of definitions, collective trauma is an event that extends beyond individuals. It's an event that is earth-shattering for a group. It's threatening for a group and influences entire communities. And when I talk about collective trauma, the one point that I emphasize is that collective trauma is not just about the loss of life. It's not just about the death toll. It's not just about how many people die, but it is a crisis of meaning for individuals and groups. And I'll focus much of my talk on that point. And collective trauma very often influences not only the current generation of people who are going through the trauma, but also subsequent generations. Okay, and here I want to begin by talking about what trauma is exactly from a psychological perspective, and what are the differences between individual level trauma and collective level trauma. So we use in regular language, we use the term trauma quite freely to describe many different things, but psychologists usually, when they talk about trauma, they refer to an event or an episode that in some way is concerned with the loss of life, with the threat of death. So death has to be a component of the event for it to constitute a trauma. And then there are differences between individual level trauma and collective level trauma. At the individual level, trauma is, of course, very personal. It's autobiographical. It's based on our personal experience. And one of the main outcomes of experiencing trauma is sometimes called post-traumatic stress disorder or reaction. And that includes being very, very sensitive to threats, seeing threats everywhere, being hypervigilant about threats, and being suspicious about everything. And individual trauma influences our self-concept. We no longer see ourselves the way we used to before. We have to reevaluate who we are and recreate our sense of self. And very often post-trauma or post-traumatic reactions are the difficulty or inability to put the pieces back together and recreate that sense of self. At the collective level, we see some things that are similar, but some things that are quite different. So collective trauma is at the collective level, of course. We're talking about something that very often is historical. It extends in time and space in the sense that people who experience collective trauma are not necessarily, or people who experience that feeling of collective trauma, or the experience of collective trauma, are not necessarily the people who witness the trauma itself. They may be removed in time. They may be descendants of those who were traumatized. They may be removed in space. They may be far away from the place where the trauma occurred. And this is where the speaker 2 weeks from now, Roxanne Cohen-Silver, is really the expert. She became very famous after 9/11, showing that people that were far away from New York City showed post-traumatic reactions. She was initially criticized for saying that because some critics were saying, how can you be traumatized by watching TV? But she showed, and today we know, that when people feel that they're part of a group and that group has been attacked, even if they're not present at the location, they can still experience post-traumatic reactions. Just like personal trauma, groups can also feel an elevated sense of threat. They may also be hypervigilant at the group level, at the collective level, and show suspicion towards other groups. And what collective trauma does to groups is it alters collective identity and meaning. And this is really what I will be focusing on today. Okay, so what are the long-term effects of collective trauma? Most of the research on collective trauma still looks at the individual level and looks at individual level pathologies. So much of the research, much of the focus is on survival health and mental health. And there is fascinating research on the intergenerational transmission of trauma, meaning that one generation experienced the trauma directly, but their children and grandchildren, or even members of the group who aren't their direct descendants, will show signs of the trauma, will react to the trauma, and there will be implications at the group level, even among people who did not experience the trauma. But what I'm interested in, and there's less research on that, are the collective level implications. So first, I asked the question, is there such a thing as collective post-trauma? Can we talk about entire groups that experience the same type of reactions that individuals do? Some scholars talk about a siege mentality. Groups that experience trauma feel that they're always under attack. They're always suspicious about other groups. They feel that everybody's out to get them. And much of my research is focused on how the memory of collective trauma, or how the experience of collective trauma, influences our political perceptions. How do we see the world? How do we understand the political world in light of the trauma? And one of the most important points that I want to emphasize today is that although we use the term collective trauma, different traumas are quite different from each other. So even though there's a common denominator of events that influence groups that involve horrific loss of life, there are important differences between collective traumas. So if we take Black slavery in the US, or the Nanjing massacre in China, or the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, or the Holocaust, each one of these events is unique in the sense that there are different implications, there are different reasons for the trauma, different implications of the trauma. Groups learn different lessons from the trauma, although there is one common denominator of massive loss of life and a shattering episode for that specific group. So let's look at some of the differences between collective traumas. One important difference is the distinction between the physical level of the trauma and the symbolic level of the trauma. And even though all traumas involve both physical and symbolic implications, it's important to understand when a trauma is mostly physical and when it is mostly symbolic. So if we take any genocide, again like the Nanjing massacre, it is much more of a physical event than anything else, because the purpose of the massacre was to kill as many people as possible. But if we take 9/11, this is actually a tricky trauma, because 9/11 is very physical in its appearance, even if we look at the picture here of planes crashing into buildings. But 9/11 wasn't just about killing 3,000 people. If there was a terrorist attack against, let's say, a football stadium in Idaho, and 3,000 people would have died, it would have been a very different type of attack than the 9/11 attacks. The 9/11 attacks were attacks against symbols of American dominance. The Twin Towers represented American economic hegemony. The Pentagon represents American military hegemony. So the 9/11 attacks are highly symbolic. And of course, the terrorists did not, they targeted those specific places because they understood the symbolic meaning of those locations. There are also differences between traumas that in terms of the level of intent. Some traumas are events of commission, such as terrorism. When terrorists attack, there is a clear intent to harm other people. But sometimes traumatic events happen not because someone intended to hurt someone else, but because of random forces of nature. So, for example, the floods in New Orleans a few years ago were very traumatic for the people living there, but no one purposely tried to hurt these people. You might say that this is a result of negligence or of not seeing something that was about to come, perhaps, but there was no clear intent. And there's an important difference between traumas that are the result of acts of omission and commission, because we are much more attuned to acts of commission. We're much more likely to notice when somebody else is trying to hurt us, and much more likely to ignore and not see events that develop slowly that could turn into a traumatic event, and we are very likely to miss them. And of course, there are differences in the extent of trauma, whether the trauma is local. Here we see a picture of the massacre in Srebrenica in Bosnia, which is a local trauma in a local place. Of course, there were implications of the trauma around the world, but it was still localized in one place, compared to COVID-19, which is a global event. And there are differences in the magnitude of the trauma. On the left, we see Hotel Europa in Belfast, Ireland. I was there a few years ago. It's the most bombed hotel in the world. This is a hotel that has been targeted by the IRA numerous times. And so this is an event that is relatively low in magnitude. Of course, it's still horrific. People still died, but it's not the same as, let's say, a nuclear attack on a country, which is much higher in magnitude. And there are differences between traumas that are perceived as historical, meaning they happened in the past, but now they have ended and something else is happening, compared to traumas that may have ended, but still feel ongoing. And when we look at the Holocaust and Black slavery, to some extent, both of these traumas have ended, but many people still experience some aspects of these traumas as ongoing. So if we take slavery in the US, then slavery was replaced with segregation, which later moved on to discrimination. And so slavery is still alive to some extent in societies where there were slaves. There are also differences in how the group understands its own trauma. Does it understand it in inclusive terms or exclusive terms? When the group thinks of its trauma in inclusive terms, then it says, okay, we were victimized, and let's make sure that nothing like this ever happens again to any other group. Some groups will say, or some individuals in groups will say, we were victimized, let's make sure that this never happens to us again. That's exclusive victimization. And here you can see this cartoon that understands never again as never again to any other group, versus Meir Kahane was a very extreme right-wing politician in Israel, right-wing leader in Israel, who's a good example of exclusive victimization. He didn't care so much about other groups, he just wanted to make sure that it never happens again to us. So this leads us to COVID-19. And how can we understand COVID-19? Does it constitute a collective trauma? I think that if we would have asked this question a year ago, the answer wouldn't be so clear. A year ago, many of us still thought that maybe this was just something mild and it will go away, and it's not such a big deal. I can say for myself, I was traveling in Spain in February 20, and I heard about what was going on in China, and it was somewhat worrisome, but I couldn't have imagined that we would be here today with masks and social isolation and all of that. So is COVID-19 a collective trauma? I think that today we can certainly say that it is. It has a very clear physical aspect to it and also a symbolic aspect to it. One of the reasons that many of us missed COVID-19 is because it's an act of omission. This isn't something that someone purposely did to us, unless of course you believe in conspiracy theories, but it probably isn't. It probably is just maybe a mistake or an act of nature or something like that. It's a global trauma. So far, we consider it a moderate level trauma because it's not as bad as the Spanish flu or other greater traumas. But of course, we're not at the end of this yet, so maybe it's too soon to say. One of the most important aspects of COVID-19 that makes it a collective trauma is that it's highly disruptive. It has changed our lives in every single aspect that you can imagine. Nothing has been spared. Everything from going to the grocery store, to going to school, to going to work, to meeting with friends, to hobbies, to leisure time activities. Really, it's hard to even think of one simple activity that hasn't been disrupted by COVID-19. It's an ongoing trauma. And COVID-19 is interesting in the sense that it is both inclusive and exclusive. On the one hand, it does emphasize our common humanity, but also each group tends to be defensive, and we'll talk a little bit more about that aspect in a few minutes. When it comes to the magnitude of COVID-19, the fact that it's a moderate trauma actually makes it a little bit more tricky, because a very extreme trauma is hard to deny. A trauma like COVID-19, we see that many people are still denying that it's an issue. Many people are still thinking that maybe it's not such a big deal, or that there's some kind of conspiracy to keep everybody indoors with masks on their face. COVID-19 disrupts our illusion of invulnerability. If up until now we felt relatively safe in the world, we are feeling less safe today. And it has given rise to many, many conspiracy theories to the point that it's hard to know what is true and what is fake. So how have we done so far with COVID-19? I would say that one very positive aspect of the struggle against COVID-19 is this amazing triumph of science. Compared to any other similar event in history, we have dealt with COVID-19 amazingly well at the scientific, at the research level. First of all, by being able to monitor people who are sick, being able to monitor who has met with who, and to somewhat contain and control the spread of the disease. And also by developing vaccines in the course of a year, vaccines that so far have proven to be very effective. There's a study that just came out in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's an Israeli study because we have become the testing ground for Pfizer. And it shows that the vaccines are extremely, extremely effective. And this is really amazing that in such a short period of time, we've been able to develop such a response to a new pandemic. But when we look at the social level, we see that there have been some problems. And one of the main issues that we see with COVID-19 is the issue of leadership. How did different leaders respond to this threat? Were they quick to understand that this is a serious threat? Did they deny it? Did they dismiss it? Did they take action to protect their people? And we see country level differences in the spread of the disease based on, of course, the response of leaders. We also see processes that are happening around the world. And here I'm presenting the American example because you're an American audience, but we see it in Israel, we see it in Britain, we see it in many places. What COVID-19 has done, it has really increased political polarization. And I just want to say a word about this. Political differences, I consider political differences to be a positive thing overall. I think that an open discussion between people who view the world in a different way is not a negative thing. But political polarization is something else. Political polarization is when political differences reach a point where both sides absolutely hate each other and cannot listen anymore to each other and have no respect for each other, and even think that the other side is the enemy and poses a great danger to the future of the group. And that's what we're seeing in many, many places around the world, because COVID-19, with the threat of death that it brings, makes everything much more amplified and more extreme. And people who don't think like us are viewed as as a life-threatening enemy. I'm currently involved in a large-scale study in 20-something countries involving nearly 30,000 participants in 3 waves of data. And we're looking at different predictors of compliance with all of the COVID requirements, like wearing masks, washing hands, social distancing, etc., and looking also at how that influences the actual outbreak of COVID, the actual spread of the disease. And what we're finding is that trust in authorities is one of the main predicting variables. In other words, in countries where the population trusts the authorities, we see much more compliance. And then we see that the disease is contained much better. In countries where at least some of the population does not trust authorities and even has a high level of distrust of authorities, that's where we see more problems. And what COVID-19 does in many Western countries is it creates a clash or a dilemma between 2 very important values, between individual liberties and social responsibility. So on the one hand, in Western civilization in particular, the notion of civil liberties or individual liberties is a very important part of what Western countries are founded on. The idea that people should be free to make their own decisions and lead their lives the way they want to. But when we live in a pandemic, that becomes a problem, or it is, or there's a tension between that value and the value of social responsibility. And we see this come up all the time. Should we force people to wear masks? Should we force people to get vaccinated? Can we do that? Is it ethical to require people to do things that maybe they don't believe in? And is it ethical to endanger other people because you don't believe in wearing a mask or getting vaccinated? So we see overall that there's a great triumph of science. Science has really shown how it can deal very quickly and very effectively with such a new disease. But when it comes to society, it's much more complex. And really the variable that influences the extent to which this event is traumatizing and the amount of damage that it causes is very much because of the social variables and not the scientific variables. So what are the implications of COVID-19? One of the main psychological implications of the pandemic is great uncertainty in many, many different areas of life. First of all, there's uncertainty about health. Many of us didn't think about health issues until COVID-19, and all of a sudden, everyone is worried about either their own health or the health of their loved ones. So there's this elevated concern about health. And there is, at a broader level, there is a shattering of an illusion of invulnerability that we all have. In order to live our lives in relative psychological equanimity, we need to have an illusion of invulnerability. We need to believe that when we get into our car, we'll be okay, and we need to believe that when we go on a plane, that we'll be okay, and whatever we do, that we're relatively safe. When something like COVID happens, our sense of invulnerability becomes somewhat disrupted. There are many, many issues that have to do with financial security and job security that are affecting many people. Many people don't know what's going to happen in the aftermath of this pandemic when it comes to their economic future. And one of the most interesting aspects of COVID-19, and this is something that we're actually doing right now, is the breakdown of geography. And there are positive and negative aspects to it. On the one hand, we've been able to deal quite well with the pandemic because we can still work online. We can still go to school online. We can still have meetings like this from one side of the world to the other online. But this also poses a threat to many systems. You know, I come from academia, so I'll just give the academic version of this threat. One thing that we are very concerned about is why would students come and study in our school if it's no longer about location? If you can just go online and maybe study at any other school in the world, you don't need to go to the school that you live next to. If we think about American institutions, the way colleges have always been is that young students go sometimes to some relatively far away remote city where there's a college town and live there for a few years and go to college. But why would anybody go to, let's say, Ann Arbor right now and not just go to the University of Michigan from home? Or why would anybody go to Syracuse? Or why would anybody go to Amherst or, you know, many other small towns where instead of just staying home and doing everything online, and the same applies to work as well. So this new technology, COVID on the one hand has accelerated the use of this technology, and there are many good things about it, but it also poses a threat. I'm not going to talk too much about this because we have another speaker next week, I believe, right, who is going to talk about the mental health aspects of COVID-19. But I can just say that in parallel to the health pandemic, there's a huge, huge mental health pandemic. Huge, it's enormous. Many people aren't aware of it, but levels of anxiety, of depression, of suicidal ideation, of family problems, violence in families, you name it. Any pathology that you can think of, any psychopathology that you can think of has gone up since COVID-19. And the longer this pandemic lasts and the longer people stay at home and experience all these uncertainties, the more of this we're going to see. One way that people have always dealt with threat is by being together with other people, physical contact with other people. That's the way we've always dealt with any kind of threat. When we feel threatened at the individual level, we want to be close to other people. The pandemic has created kind of a paradox. We feel threatened, we want to be close to other people, but we can't because it's dangerous. So we need to keep a social distance. Many people are experiencing some of the mental health issues that we talked about because of isolation, because of loneliness, because of an inability to meet their families. Hopefully with the vaccinations now, that will be possible. But for a year, many people have been isolated from the company of other people. There are also implications at the intergroup level. And this is where we see kind of an ironic response. On the one hand, COVID-19 really shows human interconnectedness. Boundaries and borders and state lines and all of that doesn't matter to a virus. Viruses jump over any kind of wall and any kind of fence and any kind of line in the sand. And in that sense, we need to understand that, or maybe today we understand more than ever before, that when there's an outbreak of a virus somewhere in China or in some other part of the world that maybe we've never been to and didn't care too much about, it should be our concern, because we know today that something that happens far away can reach us quite quickly. And in that sense, maybe COVID-19 will motivate more human cooperation. But on the other hand, it has also made people much more suspicious of other people and much more defensive of their own group. If normally we see people who are different from us as somewhat threatening and maybe contagious and maybe unclean, then when there's a viral pandemic in the air, that can only exacerbate those sentiments. So we have on the one hand, this distrust and this desire to distance from others, with a more cognitive understanding that we need to cooperate with other people in order to deal with the situation. So in the 5 minutes I still have, I'm going to talk a little bit about challenges to meaning and identity. So first of all, one of the main things that we're seeing in COVID-19 is the rise of ageism. Until a year ago, people who were 65, 75, even 85 were considered people who are very active, people who are young, who can do everything. They work, they they do various activities. They weren't considered that old. COVID-19 comes and basically tells anyone over 65, you're in a risk group. You need to stay isolated from at home. You can't see your children or grandchildren. You can't engage in all of the activities that you have engaged in. And that alters social perception. So many younger people who show, some of them show even a callous behavior towards this, are saying, okay, so this is a disease that affects old people. That's not me. So I don't care so much about this. And that has created a rift in many societies between the older generations and the younger generations. And has also defined old age at a relatively young age, over 60 or over 65, which we usually consider as relatively young. There have been changes, very dramatic changes in social representations of the group. And here, again, I'm bringing an American example because of the audience. The US has always seen itself, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but it has always seen itself as a nation that rises to the challenge. Every time there was a traumatic event in history, the US came and basically fixed it. And these pictures are, some of the more heroic moments in US history. But when we're talking about again, a threat of omission, like COVID, where there's no clear enemy, where you can't send troops, and it's hard to know at first what exactly to do, we see something completely different happening. We're seeing much more social chaos. We're seeing much more social disintegration. Many of the rifts that always existed in society are surfacing and becoming much more extreme than they ever were before. I don't think it's a coincidence that all of these different events that we're seeing here are happening at a time of COVID-19. And they're happening in my country as well, in Israel. In Israel, we're seeing many of the rifts in our society, for example, with Arab citizens of Israel and with ultra-Orthodox citizens of Israel. The rifts between these different groups have existed before, but COVID-19 has exacerbated all of that. And in the Israeli example, that happened primarily because of trust or lack of trust in authorities. Many of these groups have less trust in authorities than other groups. And as a result, there's less compliance and more outbreaks. And that, of course, makes everything much more, that increases the tensions and makes things more extreme. So we're seeing this all over the world. So in conclusion, I think that it's quite clear that COVID-19 has developed into a global collective trauma, even if initially we didn't see it as such. It creates an enormous amount of uncertainty and challenges the basic elements of the way that we live. It threatens both personal and collective identity. It calls into question the position of our group in the world. Who exactly are we? How do we define ourselves in the aftermath of this collective trauma? It opens and intensifies social wounds. But I want to end with a more positive note, maybe the silver lining in all of this. It also really underscores human interconnectedness. And if there's something that we can take from this, we could see it as a wake-up call to warn us against the next global catastrophe that might also be a threat of omission, that maybe as a result of COVID-19, we will open our eyes and see it soon enough and react to it maybe in a better way than we reacted to this specific trauma. Okay, so thank you. And I think we'll open the floor for questions at this point.
There you are. Thank you, Gilad. That was fantastic. And I have the chat room open and I can read questions if you all have any. I do have one as people maybe want to enter their questions or if you want to wave your hand. You mentioned that Israel is always prepared and we were talking about America is not as prepared for kind of catastrophes. What do you, how do you, when you contribute or attribute Israel being so far ahead in vaccinations and, you know, your reaction, the government's reaction to the pandemic?
I actually don't think we're really ahead. I think that because Israeli society is very fragmented, not unlike American society, it's been a real challenge to deal with the pandemic because there's so many groups that don't trust the authorities, don't trust scientists, don't trust the government, don't trust other groups or whatever. It's been, and also part of Israeli nature is to not be very disciplined. That's, you know, we almost pride ourselves in that. And so overall, it's been a real challenge to get people to comply with all the different restrictions. We've been lucky with the vaccinations. The idea of turning Israel into a kind of the testing ground for the Pfizer vaccines has done miracles. We see how the infection rate is going down. We see how people who are vaccinated, even those who eventually get sick, they don't get very sick. And you talked about Israel's preparedness for traumatic events or catastrophes. We are very well prepared for acts of commission, for other groups trying to attack us. But like other places in the world, we did not respond very well to an event that first developed very slowly and did not seem to pose such a severe threat and turned into what it has turned into today.
Thank you. I do have a question. Says you talk about trust and leadership as related to compliance with dealing with the pandemic. Do you have examples of countries or areas with good basis of trust? And what factors do you feel help to build that trust?
Let me see for a minute. Could you repeat that? I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
Okay. Do you have examples of countries or areas in the world with the good basis of trust? Yeah. And okay. What factors do you feel help to build that trust?
Yeah. Well, you know, I can think of two countries in particular where there's a high level of trust in authorities. One country that really deserves a medal for how it has dealt with COVID-19 is New Zealand.
Right.
I think that it's both the leadership of the Prime Minister of New Zealand and maybe something about the character of that nation, of the people who you know, were ready to do what was needed. And you know, they were under lockdown for a very long time, but they managed to get rid of the virus to a large extent. And that's really remarkable. Another country where we see a high level of compliance, and that's also definitely part of their national character, is Germany. So even though Germany has had periods where it wasn't managing the disease very well, the population overall was compliant. The population overall did what it was supposed to do, and was willing to give up many individual liberties for the collective good. Also, I need to say that aside from leadership and trust and compliance, another very important factor is the health system in these different countries. In countries where the health system worked well at times without a pandemic, it also worked well during the pandemic.
So I have a comment that they're both female leaders.
Yeah, that's right.
And
maybe that has something to do with it. You know, maybe I don't want to be stereotypical, but maybe Men need to find something to bomb when dealing with a crisis like this, and women are much better at building community. Again, that might be a little too stereotypical, but you're right that these are two female leaders that have done very well.
Or it's communities that pick the female leader to be the manager
right.
at the time.
That definitely could be.
Any other questions? I got the chat room open, or if you can wave, I might be able to see you now. So I put it on gallery view. Anyone? Tony. I think you're on, Tony.
I'm trying to get it unmuted. I'm concerned about the children. Have you seen any instances around the world, particularly, let's say, age groups from 8 to 16 that have helped through the process of all the trauma, particularly in not going to school and social interaction?
Yeah, I didn't even touch upon the issue of children, but you're right that they are one of the most heavily affected groups. You know, having children of my own that try to study on Zoom, I can say a few things. First of all, that of course they're not getting the same kind of education that they would have received in the classroom. There's no way that a 6-year-old can sit in front of a computer all day and really study, or a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old. Also, what is happening is that the gaps between the rich and the poor, or people who come from stronger families to less strong families, these gaps are increasing. First of all, for very simple technical reasons. If you have 3 kids at home and you also work from home, that means that you need at least 4, maybe 5 computers at home. People who don't have the resources to buy that many computers, somebody's not going to be online. Somebody's not going to be at school if they don't have those resources. It's also a matter of computer literacy. Parents who are more educated are able to help their children get through a day on Zoom. But parents who don't use a computer themselves or don't know much about that are not going to be able to help their children as much. And this is going to, if there's an education gap to begin with, it's going to increase even more. So we can expect that to happen. Aside from that, children more than anybody else need to be with other children. And having children stay at home for such an extended period of time, not meeting with friends, playing video games half the day, that can't be good. And we're going to see the long-term implications of that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Robert.
Hey, first of all, thank you very much. It was a really great presentation. One of the things that I was reading is about the human's attention span to trauma is short, and history repeats itself, and we tend to do things and forget what could have helped avoid it again in the future once it passes. The question I have is that a coping mechanism itself, just trying to forget about the event so that we aren't really preparing for the next round of something, or is there something that we could be doing to enable us not to forget the lessons learned that we just aren't doing?
Okay, that's a very good question, and it reminds me a little bit of the Spanish flu 100 years ago, which is very often referred to as the forgotten flu. And I think it's the forgotten flu, first of all, because it comes at the heels of World War I, which was a very traumatic event that everybody remembered, but also because we are much less likely to remember acts of omission compared to acts of commission. With acts of commission, the lesson is very clear. Let's make sure they don't get us again. What are the lessons from acts of omission? What are we going to remember exactly from COVID-19, and what lessons can we learn? It's much more difficult to think about that. But I think that there are lessons, and I think that it is important that we remember this period. First of all, for the memory of this period itself, but also, as I said before, because there are other issues that are looming in the future, such as climate change, that are very similar in the way that they develop. And if we learn the lessons of COVID-19 and apply them to dealing with climate change, and understand that if icebergs are melting in the North Pole, that's just like a virus in Wuhan, China. It doesn't affect us right now, but it's going to affect us at some point in the future.
Thank you.
Adriana, are you unmuted? Good. Okay.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much. This was incredibly informative, and it's the first conversation I've been a part of where we're thinking about a collective trauma. It's so important. So I was thinking about, I really appreciate the question Tony Jones asked about the children, because I just keep thinking about the idea of the mental health pandemic. I was just in a Zoom right before this earlier about how this has impacted mental health in youth in Orange County. And, so it made me just wonder about the different demographics, right? The different demographic populations. So in thinking about that, I was thinking, have you had an opportunity to ask about or research trauma, collective trauma around immigrant populations? So for example, it could be thought about in so many different ways. That's just the general question. But as you were speaking about mental health, I was thinking about, for example, the population in the border where both countries are impacted, right? And so anyway, so it's just a whole another way of thinking that I really appreciate. I'd like to have what you can say about that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for that question. It's a very important question. And although I don't study children, so I can't give you, my own experience of this, what we know is that populations that were struggling even before the pandemic are at a serious disadvantage, and even a greater disadvantage as a result of the pandemic. Because if immigrant populations we're trying to integrate to the best of their ability, and send their kids to school, and do all the things in order to get ahead in society. The pandemic has stopped that, and again, because of lack of resources and lack of opportunities, etc., they are much more likely to fall behind than stronger populations. So one thing that we should really be aware of is that the rifts in society and the discrepancies and disparities in societies are likely to grow as a result of this pandemic. I'm not even talking about the economic fallout that I don't think we're seeing yet. I'm not an economist, but just looking at what's happening all over the world. I mean, the economy of almost every country in the world right now is on life support. Governments are giving their citizens payments to keep everybody afloat, but that's going to stop at some point. And what's going to happen then, I don't even want to think about that, but that of course is going to always hit the weaker populations more than the stronger populations.
Thank you. Nancy McLaughlin, you have your hand raised.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. Hi, thank you for this. I was just wondering if once you recognize that there's a collective trauma, like what do we know what societies can do, right? For an individual trauma, we kind of know how to treat it, but when a society is caught in a collective trauma and suffering polarization, are there things that society can do to get out of that? And can they start doing that while the trauma is still going on? Or I don't know, or is it too early to say?
Thank you, Nancy. That's a very good question. And one of the topics that I've been studying a lot recently has to do with political polarization and exactly with that question. Because as I said before, I think political differences are a good thing. I don't think that everybody needs to think the same way. And there are many advantages to having a group with different members with different ideas or different perceptions of the world. The problem begins when people from different groups or different ideologies start hating each other and are incapable of listening to each other, and then incapable of working together to find solutions to collective problems. So if we take the issue of COVID-19 and see it as a collective trauma, what we would like to do is to have people from different ideologies sit together and think of how to find the best balance between their different concerns. So some people are going to say individual liberties are very important. Other people are going to say social responsibility is much more important than individual liberties. Instead of fighting with each other, maybe they can try to find some kind of common ground that will find a good balance between the need to preserve individual liberties, because after all, the United States and many other Western countries are founded on the idea of individual freedom. But on the other hand, at a time of a pandemic, social responsibility and responsibility for the welfare and health of others is also very important. So without such a discussion, it's very difficult to deal with a collective level trauma.
Thank you.
I think that's, we're getting close to the end here. We have time for perhaps one more question. If anyone has it, they can wave. I don't see anyone right now. Gilad, we just really thank you for getting up so early. And
I usually get up at 6, so it's only an hour earlier.
Oh yeah, I was thinking 4, so it makes me feel a little bit better. Can you tell us a little bit about your colleague Anat? She will be with us next Wednesday, and you mentioned she'll be discussing the clinical side of it, and you know her well. Could you give us a minute or so on her? And
so Anat is a clinical psychologist and a clinical researcher. Her specialty is bullying and suicide, especially among teenagers, and of course mental health problems in general. And she is a great speaker and a very smart woman, and she will tell you everything there is to know about the other pandemic, the mental health pandemic. And I'm sure that she'll, in particular, she'll talk about the issue of depression and suicide that have become a much greater concern in the past year than ever before. They always are a concern, but things have gotten worse, of course, ever since the pandemic started.
right, great. Well, I can't thank you enough for being with us tonight, and thank you. We really appreciate all your time, Gilad. Fantastic.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Thanks for the great questions and discussion, and stay healthy and safe.
You the same. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.